All right, I think I can get started, and hopefully some more people will join. Hi, everybody. We are very fortunate to host Omri Boehm today from the New School for Social Research. Omri will be giving a talk on his new book on Haifa Republic. If I could just ask everybody to turn their sound off. Omri is a scholar focused on early modern philosophy, and Kant has written books on those subjects, as well as this new title on redefining Zionism. So Omri, without much further ado, and to leave as much time as possible that I can to you, thank you for joining us. It's a wonderful book, and it's an honor to have you. So take it away.
Thanks very much. Well, first, thanks for being so generous with my book. And maybe without too much introductions, I can say just this, that I'm sorry that I cannot be there in person. I actually used to live in Boston as a child for a couple of years, and then also partly as a student. And I wish I could have taken the opportunity of this invitation to come to campus. This is not how things happen these days. And also, I'm actually sitting home, still isolated with COVID. That's not an issue. I'm feeling completely fine. But my little child here around the corner is also home. I hope that he can be more or less quiet most of the time. But if there will be any disturbances, there will be due to the situation of everybody isolating at home. But I don't think this should be an issue. I intend to read for maybe 45, 50 minutes. If anyone wants to interrupt me in the middle, that is fine as well. I'm, of course, thankful to questions after. Here's how the story begins. In October 2013, the Israeli Supreme Court, famous for its liberalism, rejected the adjective Israeli as an official civil designation in Israel. According to the justices, the contenders, who had asked to be labeled Israeli rather than Jewish on their personal ID cards, did not, and this is now a quote from the decision, did not sufficiently prove the existence of an Israeli nation. For the foreseeable future, therefore, the civil designation of Israel's Jewish citizens remains Jewish. Arab citizens are often designated Arab or sometimes minority, name Yutim. Putting aside for the moment the irony involved in the fact that an Israeli court would make such a decision, presumably the court is not Jewish, or is it? The ruling certainly expressed the overlapping consensus among Israel's Jewish society. The state of Israel is and ought to remain a Jewish state. And indeed, Zionists and anti-Zionists nowadays take it for granted that the existence of a Jewish state in Palestine or in Eretz Israel is what Zionism is essentially about. But then here's a question, it's an old question raised anew. Can a state be both Jewish and a liberal democracy? And is it true that Zionism necessarily consists in the idea of a Jewish state? I would like to argue that a worthwhile future for Israelis and Palestinians depends on realizing that the answer to both questions is negative. A Jewish state cannot be a liberal democracy, but the Zionist ambition for Jewish self-determination, national self-determination, can be preserved. In fact, it is best preserved in a state that is not Jewish. Significantly, this is a fact that Zionism's early leaders and thinkers, from Herzl to Ben-Gurion, understood. But current liberal Zionist thinkers, again, as well as anti-Zionist thinkers, have managed to forget. And so what I'd like to do in this talk is to shake the passionately held consensus, the agreement between Zionists and anti-Zionists alike about what Zionism is and ought to be. So So the paper has some rather different moving parts. So here is a roadmap for how it's going to unfold. First, I would like to argue very clearly against the current concept of liberal Zionism, which clings to the idea of a liberal Jewish state. I'd like to argue very directly and clearly why a Jewish state cannot be a liberal democracy. Second, I want to go historical to argue that for the founding fathers of Zionism, the end or the telos of Zionist politics was not a Jewish state. It was not about Jewish sovereignty. The founding fathers of Zionism all agreed about binational politics. Lastly, I want to go into more recent history, to the often forgotten, and I believe always misunderstood, Begin Autonomy Plan of 1977, in order to show that binational politics can actually be imagined from within Israel's actual politics, that is post-state, post-occupation, not just from the far and deeply buried history of Zionism. Okay, so first, and in many ways, the main part of the talk, certainly when presented in a philosophy department, liberal Zionism as we know it. One of the clearest articulation of current Zionist or liberal Zionist convictions as we've come to know them is that of the Israeli philosopher Moshe Halbertal. In an influential Haaretz article, he dismisses the question whether a Jewish state can be a liberal democracy as irrelevant. By the way, the paper was just republished a couple of months ago by Leon Wieseltier in the newly founded journal Liberties. For those of you who subscribe, I think that people do subscribe often to that new publication. Wieseltier, it's interesting because not only that that article was republished there in English, it was republished along with a 20-page attempt to massacre my Haifa Republic by Wieseltier himself in Liberty. So this is interesting. It's a good read. Don't believe everything that Wieseltier says about me. I return to, and I'm happy to explain in the Q&A. I return to a quote from Moshe Halbertal that explains the beginning of why there is just no question whether a Jewish state can also be a liberal democratic state. Quote, "There is no big question whether a state can be both Jewish and a liberal democracy. A serious political intellectual debate should turn rather on the question," and this is a quote, it's important, "what kind of a Jewish state we want to have," end quote. It is worthwhile to return to what Halbertal has to say in that essay. It contains an eloquent articulation of what I take to be the most powerful defense available of liberal Zionism. In order to examine whether there is a contradiction in the notion of a Jewish liberal democracy, Halbertal says, one must first, quote, "find what a Jewish state is." And I continue to quote, "It is possible, of course, to ascribe the adjective Jewish a nationalistic or a religious fundamentalist meaning, and then to go on arguing that a Jewish democratic combination is impossible. But this would be a circular argument and not very fruitful," end quote. The charge of circularity is, of course, correct, but rather misleading. The question at stake is rather whether any definition of the adjective Jewish and any definition of who's Jewish and who's not would allow for a state that's also a liberal democracy. Halbertal provides a clear answer in the essay, and it is a familiar one. Judaism obviously need not be understood as an orthodox religion. It can also be interpreted as a pluralistic cultural identity. Therefore, given that cultural neutrality is not, in Halbertal's view, necessary for democratic liberalism, he believes in the existence of a right to culture, a term that I will return to in a moment. He believes in the existence of a right to culture. There is no contradiction in the notion of a liberal Jewish state. Okay. In an earlier paper, which Halbertal published with Avishai Margalit, another prominent Israeli philosopher, titled Liberalism and the Right to Culture, the two philosophers had argued that, and this is a quote, human beings have a right to culture, not just any culture, but their own. They claim that because one's personality is determined, among other things, by one's particular culture, one has a right to preserve this culture and ensure that it would flourish. Moreover, given this right, it is a sovereign's duty to protect culture, not just in some cosmopolitan sense of the term, but to take off sometimes the gloves of cultural neutrality that may characterize liberal democracies and actively defend its citizens' rights to their particular cultures, to their own cultures. According to Albert Al-Margalit, quote, the right to culture in a liberal state permits the state to be culturally neutral, if at all, only with respect to the dominant culture of the majority, and only on the assumption that the dominant culture of the majority can take care of itself, end quote. In his Haaretz article, then, Albert Al applies the same logic to the question of Zionism. While it is Israel's obligation to defend the rights of its minorities to their own cultures, it is also its right, in fact, its duty, to defend its majority's right to Judaism. From this perspective, Albert Al argues, there is no difference between Israel and other culturally non-neutral European nation states, such as, and this is a quote, Denmark, Finland, Norway, Germany, the Czech Republic, and more. Importantly, other prominent liberal Zionist philosophers have made similar arguments, in fact, identical arguments. Consider Michael Walzer, Avishai Margalit that was mentioned, Joseph Raz, Chaim Gantz, by the way, all people that I know to varying degrees and respect, but still it is also time to say clearly, I think this understanding of liberal Zionism is false, I even think obviously false, and ought to be left behind. The reasons are the following. Despite the fact that Judaism is no doubt a culture, belonging to it still requires what one might regard as the opposite of culture, nature or blood. Religious Jews commonly subscribe to this ethnic condition, as do secular Jews, including those for whom religious Judaism is completely passé. Therefore, the comparison between a Jewish and, say, a Finnish state is idle. Even if there is no contradiction in the notion of a Finnish or a German democracy, there is one in the notion of a Jewish democracy. For even if cultural neutrality is not necessary for democratic liberalism, ethnic neutrality certainly is. Quite simply, it is possible to be a Finnish or a Norwegian Jew, just as it is possible to be a German Jew or a Palestinian, Muslim, or Christian. But for logical rather than merely political reasons, it is impossible to become a Christian or a Muslim Jew. Neither is it possible to be a Muslim or a Christian Israeli, and not merely because Israel's Supreme Court insisted that an Israeli nation does not exist. As long as Israel is essentially a Jewish state, being Jewish is actually essential to being Israeli. A non-Jew can be an Israeli citizen and carry what we call sometimes a blue identification card and passport, but she or he would not for all that be Israeli. The state would not in so much belong to her. Andrew Pessin, a well-respected expert on early modern philosophy, so in that sense, really a colleague of mine, once accused me, after I've made this argument, in the Times of Israel, of introducing, and this is a quote, confusions and inconsistencies about the unclarified notion of a state belonging to a people. I'm quoting Pessin still, Boehm's intellectually and morally corrupt strategy, his dishonest, intentionally introduced logical fallacies are designed to promote a double standard, that is, anti-Semitic, arguments against the rights of Jews to their own country. So let me specify very carefully here what is meant by the idea of a state belonging to its people. I submit that there is nothing confusing, inconsistent, or unclear about it, let alone immoral. When Abraham Lincoln avowed democracy at Gettysburg as a government of the people, by the people, for the people, he expressed the basic idea that democratic states belong to the people. More specifically, the idea is that democratic states belong to their peoples because in democracies, the sovereignty lies in the hand of the people. In a Jewish state, the clause, the people, designates the Jews rather than citizens regardless of religion and race. There is no getting around the fact that a Jewish democracy is therefore a government of the Jews, by the Jews, and for the Jews. It is hard to imagine that any current Zionist, liberal or not, would deny that Zionism as we know it is bound to the idea that Jews have the right to their own sovereign state, to Jewish sovereignty. But then the analogy between the political standing of, say, an Italian Jewish minority and an Arab or Palestinian minority in Israel is futile. Jews in Italy are integrally included in their state's political identity and ought to be insulted if anyone questioned their belonging to the sovereign Italian people. Only racists in Italy would deny that Jews, because they're Jews, are not part of the sovereign Italian people. Palestinians in Israel are, to put it simply, not Jewish. They do not belong to the sovereign Jewish people. Because of their ethnic belonging, sovereignty is not in their hands. In short, if there is no contradiction in the notion of a Jewish liberal democracy, then there isn't one in the notion of a liberal democratic ethnocracy. There is no point in attempting to square that circle, I think, but generations of Israeli philosophers, and the best ones, Halbertal, Margalit, Raz, as well as public intellectuals, consider David Grossman, Amos Oz, consider a judge like Aharon Barak, have pretended that they can. By the way, as a footnote, I had an explicit debate with Moshe Halbertal about this. The host was Peter Beiner, and he surprised me with some of the answers that he's given to this. I'm not incorporating his answers into this talk, but don't hesitate to ask me about this, and I can mention this in a few words. Now, it is common to argue nowadays that whereas Israel as we know it, occupying the Palestinians, is not a liberal democracy, a Jewish state could have been one in principle if it had only granted non-Jews their full rights. On this prevalent view, the occupation corrupted Zionism, but this is a contingent fact, an accident that happened to Israel around 1967. This claim sounds commonsensical to some, and it also gives liberal Zionists the old definition of liberal Zionism hope. If the current situation is only contingent, we can still save Zionist ambitions by, say, salvaging the two-state solution. The country could in principle treat Palestinians differently than it has in the past, and it could do so in the future. I want to say that this optimism is false, and not just for contingent political reasons. A Jewish state could not have treated Palestinians in any other way that it has in the past, and it will not do so in the future. The idea that it could, in a way, constitutes liberal Zionists' perhaps deepest betrayal of liberal principles, and it is important to see why. An axiomatic assumption driving liberal politics is a thought, it will be familiar to people in this meeting, that in order to defend citizens' rights, political power must be restrained. Where the power of government can be abused, it would be. The separation of power, checks and balances, keeping church and state apart, and committing to binding constitutions are deemed, and that's the point, right, necessary to prevent powerful individuals, classes, and groups from abusing their power and taking over the state, that is, robbing sovereignty from the hands of the people. However, since a Jewish democracy expresses Jewish sovereignty, the idea that Jews in their own state would grant non-Jews their rights, which clearly isn't successful in practice, isn't good even in theory. If it were, liberal democracies wouldn't be required at all. It would make much more sense to let a wise, just sovereign govern and trust that he, it would be a he, would do a better job than the voting multitudes at ensuring the rights of citizens. This type of logic is, of course, familiar, at least since Plato's Republic, but it is hardly a liberal democratic one. It is time to admit that the Jewish people wouldn't give non-Jews their rights in their own Jewish state any more than a benevolent tyrant would give people their rights in his state. In a liberal democracy, the sovereign people give rights to themselves. The question is who belongs to the people. Consider here again Halbertal's claim that I quoted above, that there is, quote, no question whether a state can be both Jewish and liberal. And I'm still quoting, the only question is what kind of a Jewish state we want to have in Israel. Of course, the most telling little word here is we. Obviously, it designates the Jews. The Arabs aren't included in the deliberation what type of a Jewish state we want to have in our country. A worthwhile future in Israel, not just for Arabs, but also for Jews. Ruling over others is not good to the soul. Demands that we finally overcome the self-deception that this is or can be left liberal democratic logic. What we should do is work on a civil designation, we, that's based on citizenship and can be common to Jews and Palestinians. I have more to say about this in the book. I'm not going to enter that here at this moment, but we can talk about this also at the Q&A. The Jewish state, for these reasons, is not and cannot be a liberal democracy. Going on defending the Jewish and democratic slogan, all the more as Israel has obviously buried the two-state solution, and Palestinians now constitute about 50% within Israel's de facto borders. Going on defending in the 21st century the idea that ethnic politics can be liberal is as hopeless as denying global warming. The consequences are already disastrous for the Palestinians. They will be disastrous to Israelis too, and to world Jewry. Do we need to leave Zionism behind? I think that in some sense we do, and in some sense we don't. If we cling to the prevalent assumption shared by Zionists and anti-Zionists, that Zionism's very essence is the existence of a Jewish state, that the idea of securing the Jews' right to national self-determination is synonymous with Jewish sovereignty, in short, that the Jewish state that was established on May 14th, 1948, is a telos of Zionist political ambitions, liberal Zionism ought to be abandoned. But for this reason, now is an excellent time for Zionists to reconsider this false but sanctified axiom about a Jewish state. Jews may well have the right to national self-determination, but the assumption that this right is necessarily or best defended in a sovereign state is, to say the least, debatable. The idea that nations are supposed to express themselves as sovereign political entities is not, in fact, a national, but a nationalist idea. It is created not by the desire to protect national or cultural rights, but they wish to elevate the nation as a supreme category, the ultimate arbiter of identity, meaning, and power. And so far as defending Jews' national and cultural rights is at stake, rather than sacralizing Jewish nationalism, a sub-sovereign political autonomy within a constitutional federative structure could do a better job protecting Jewish education, art, and religion, preserve the study and status of Hebrew. In fact, a much better job than a Jewish state does. By the way, I'm willing to protect that, to defend that claim. I'm not doing this here. But in fact, the Jewish state, because it's Jewish, that also is just a corollary of liberal doctrine, because it is a Jewish state, attacks Jewish religion and Jewish culture. Needless to say, such a federative constellation would also do a better job protecting the national rights of Palestinians, this is an understatement, along those of Jews. Such a sub-sovereign political entity may sound like a post or an anti-Zionist utopia, and utopian it may well be. After all, Theodor Herzl's 1902 utopian novel, Alt Neuland, envisions the socioeconomic, cultural, and political life in the state of the Jews as a non-sovereign, cultural, political autonomy lying side by side with other such autonomies under Ottoman sovereignty. The idea of a fully fledged Jewish sovereignty was altogether foreign to Herzl's thoughts and dreams, but he was not for all that less of a Zionist. Most Herzl interpreters have been tempted to assume that Alt Neuland's Jewish autonomy model represented a break from his 1896 Zionist manifesto, The Jewish State, which, as seems to be obviously suggested by its title, stands for Jewish statehood or sovereignty. Either a radical shift in Herzl's thinking, the argument goes, or an attempt to conceal his treasonous ambitions vis-a-vis Palestine's Ottoman rulers are responsible for Alt Neuland's portrayal of the Jewish state as mere autonomous district in Palestine rather than a sovereign nation state. However, the idea that Herzl's Alt Neuland on the one hand and the Jewish state on the other stand for different Zionist visions is nothing but a myth. One that in all likelihood has been created by ideological misinterpretation of Herzl's work from the retroactive perspective of the sovereign Jewish state that was eventually established, presenting it as the obvious, necessary telos of Zionist politics all along. By the way, here I'm following an historian, an excellent historian, Dmitry Shumsky, also in Haaretz opedist, who does not share my politics, but the history is very much aligned on his excellent digging into deeper Zionist sources. There is every reason to assume that no break in Herzl's Zionist thinking ever occurred. When European nations in Herzl's time, say the Czech or the Hungarians, spoke about attaining their own state, they had in mind a national territorial autonomy, national self-determination under imperial sovereignty. State in Herzl's, the Jewish state, is the same non-sovereign political entity Herzl would later describe in Alt Neuland. But by the false understanding of Zionism that has been created in the meantime, Herzl was an anti-Zionist. And not just he. The same retroactive ideological distortion is responsible for the common understanding of Achad Ha'am and his position as cultural and essentially non-political. The Israelis here, or people who know Zionist writings would know this distinction, cultural, non-political form of Zionism. In fact, Achad Ha'am's Zionism is as political as it could be. Well aware of the existence of a Palestinian people in the land, he advocated for a Jewish cultural autonomy in Palestine, existing alongside Palestinian autonomy in one binational federation. Only retrospective ideology can dismiss his Zionist binational politics as non-political because binational. Unlike Herzl, Achad Ha'am vehemently supported the revival of Hebrew as a Jews' national language. Unlike Herzl, he wasn't attached to existing empires. He understood that they will fade. And unlike Herzl, he gave much weight to the presence of the Palestinian people in the territory. He was, unlike Herzl, alert to the main political questions that would haunt Zionism ever since. On the issue of the Jewish state sub-sovereign status, however, Achad Ha'am and Herzl consented. They were against. Quote from Achad Ha'am, "The situation makes Palestine a joint home of different nations, each of which is trying to build its own traditional home." And I continue to quote, "In such a situation, it is no longer possible for the national home of one to be complete and encompass every aspect of this term, that is sovereignty. If you do not go about building your home in a field empty of people, but rather in a place where there are other homes and residents, then of course you can only be the sole ruler inside your own gates. There, inside, you can organize your belongings as you see fit, but beyond your gates, all residents of the area must walk together and the overall leadership must be agreed upon for the benefits of all, end quote. Whereas Herzl's political Zionism was falsely presented as supporting Jewish sovereignty, it wasn't. Ahad Ha'am could not be distorted in this way. He's very clear about his binationalism. He was clearly against sovereignty, but it was impossible to dismiss him as an anti-Zionist either. It's Ahad Ha'am. Instead, then, he has been presented as a non-political Zionist. Again, on the main current political question, a Jewish state for and against, these Zionist founding fathers agreed they were for principled reasons against. In public consciousness, and sometimes among experts, it is common to think that the binationalism of Ahad Ha'am's cultural rather than political sort enjoyed no lasting continuity, or that if it did, then only among the far-fetched Brit Shalom of intellectuals like Martin Buber or Hannah Arendt. Yehuda Magnus is another important name here. But Brit Shalom's continuity with Ahad Ha'am's position was due mainly to the significance that they both gave to the revival of Hebrew and Jewish culture, not to their allegedly post-Zionist binational politics, which, I repeat, up until very late in Zionist history, remained a matter of consensus among Zionists. Criticizing Brit Shalom, again, people like Buber, in 1926, Jabotinsky, the raving right-wing nationalist, objected to their wish to establish a Jewish state too soon, while Palestine's population was still a tiny minority. On their binational plan, Jabotinsky in that text made sure to emphasize there is absolutely no disagreement. Quote, this is a quote from Jabotinsky, the future of Palestine must be founded, legally speaking, as a binational state, end quote. Throughout his career, Jabotinsky supported the idea of what he calls Nationalitätenstaat, as opposed to a Nationalstaat, a multinational federation as opposed to a nation state. He wouldn't give up on this notion also once World War I was over, the empires have collapsed, and he started advocating for the creation of a Jewish state in broader Palestine. His 1940s A Jewish War Front, which would be Jabotinsky's last and most mature political text, explains that, and I'm quoting, the Jewish and Arab ethno-communities shall be recognized as autonomous public bodies of equal status before the law. That's Jabotinsky. Each ethno-community shall elect its national diet with the right to issue ordinances and levy taxes within the limits of its autonomy, and to appoint a national executive responsible before the diet, end quote. If I hadn't told you that this was Jabotinsky, I could have easily convinced you that this was Hannah Arendt, commonly regarded as an anti-Zionist. Ben-Gurion, similarly to Herzl and Jabotinsky, was initially committed to an autonomous national district under imperial sovereignty, Ottoman sovereignty. Once the empires collapsed, in the aftermath of the First World War, he began advocating for a sovereign Jewish state, but he had anything but abandoned his vision of a, quote, decentralized government that is akin to Jabotinsky's Nationalitätenstaat rather than Nationalstaat, in which both Jews and Palestinians exercise national self-determination in cultural autonomies. That is, read carefully in those years, by sovereignty, Ben-Gurion actually means, for the most part, self-determination. Quote from Ben-Gurion, whatever kind of government there will be in Palestine, in such a country with such a great multiplicity of races, ethnicities, religions, international political connection, and socio-cultural doctrines, it is impossible that there could be one law and one arrangement. This makes it necessary for the central national government to minimize itself to only those governmental functions that must naturally be concentrated in one national administration. And the conclusion is that the situation in the country necessitates an autonomous arrangement for all the many habitations in Palestine. That is also the Jews and Palestinians. And I'm quoting still, our aim is not to rule over others, not to be a ruler nation like all the other ruler nations. Our goal is that we be the masters of our own fate, no more, no less. All other notions undermine our existence in Palestine, end quote. When Ben-Gurion, the reader of Plato, emphasizes that it is not our aim, this was a quote, to rule over others. It's important to understand this quote in its historical context. It is not our aim to rule over others as a ruler nation. He does not speak about a regime like the West Bank's military occupation, which back then he could not yet foresee. He speaks of Palestinians living in a Jewish state under Jewish sovereignty. Back then, at least, he understood that the Jewish and democratic formula was contradictory. Autonomy was therefore the desired model for both Jews and Palestinian self-determination. The Jews would be able to run their lives without corrupting themselves as a ruler nation. The point is, for those who still like to think that the occupation corrupted Zionism, you see here Ben-Gurion de facto admitting that what would corrupt Zionism is the idea of a sovereign Jewish state. Of course, I'm not pretending that he would not take a completely different position later, and it's an interesting question to ask why and how, and we can talk about this. In the early 30s, the principles outlined in the speech that I just read from were gathered into a quasi-constitutional binational document composed by Ben-Gurion himself. For time, I'm skipping it here. It's a long quote, an interesting one, but I'm just going over it. All right, once a quintessential Zionist consensus, the idea of a binational federation was obliterated from Zionist political thinking, almost from political memory. And I'm, again, not entering here for how it was obliterated and why, and we can talk about that. Of course, the Holocaust has something to do with that, to say the least, and this is a significant topic. In our post-two-state era, I think, the question is the following. Can such binationalism be revived? Is it possible to think such politics from within Israel's actual politics, in view of the reality of the Jewish state that now already exists, in view of the fact that we've been occupying the Palestinians for 50 and more years? And I want to suggest that despite appearances, it can at least be imagined. Here's how. It is all too common nowadays to speculate whether Rabin, if he lived, would have managed to push through a two-state solution, or to debate how far Ehud Olmert or Ehud Barak were prepared to go in order to achieve separation from the Palestinians. These idle what-if speculations mostly reveal the limits of our thinking, the barriers that are imposed on what seems possible and what cannot be imagined under current political constraints and taboos. It would be more fruitful, I think, to turn the gaze further back to Menachem Begin, Israel's first right-wing prime minister, a disciple of Jabotinsky, and I think that's not a coincidence, rejected all territorial compromise in 1947 when Ben-Gurion famously celebrated the UN's partition resolution. In the late 70s, however, when pressed by President Carter and Egypt's President Anwar Sadat to include an offer to the Palestinians as part of the peace agreement with Egypt, he returned to them with a surprising plan. At first, the proposal, titled Home Rule for Palestinian Arabs Residents of Judea, Samaria, and the Gaza District, and dated December 15, 1977, was kept as a top secret. Each sketch is worth outlining here for a moment. I'm reading from the document. 1. The administration of the military government in the West Bank and Gaza will be abolished. 2. An administrative autonomy of the residents, by the residents, and for them will be established in the West Bank and Gaza. The administrative autonomy will be elected by democratic elections. 3. All administrative affairs of the areas of the West Bank and Gaza will be under the direction and within the competence of this administrative council. 4, and here is a catch, not catch in a bad sense of the term. Residents of the West Bank and Gaza will be offered full Israeli citizenship. Full Israeli citizenship. 5. A committee will be established with representatives of Israel, Jordan, and the Palestinian Administrative Council to determine, and it's important to say that I'm quoting, norms whereby Arab refugees residing outside the West Bank and Gaza district will be permitted to immigrate to these areas in reasonable numbers. Begin specified to Carter in a separate letter that they speak of numbers in the hundreds of thousands. 6. Residents of the West Bank and Gaza who choose Israeli citizenship will be entitled to vote for and be elected to the Knesset. Obviously, they're citizens. 7. Residents of Israel will be entitled to acquire land and settle in the areas of the West Bank and Gaza. Arabs, residents of the West Bank and Gaza, that is, whether they chose to become citizens or not, will be entitled to acquire land and settle in Israel. 8, and last point now for us, residents of Israel and residents of the West Bank and Gaza will be assured full freedom of movement and freedom of economic activity in Israel, the West Bank, and Gaza, that is, on the whole territory. Most Israelis are unaware that a plan of this sort ever existed, or slightly more accurately for the Israelis here, those who do remember it and have heard of the Begin plan know that an autonomy was offered to the Palestinians. But the most striking element in this plan, the fact that this autonomy was coupled with the option of full Israeli citizenship to every Palestinian in the West Bank and Gaza, remains overlooked. And not just overlooked. Most Israelis, when they hear that this plan existed, they are confident that I get the facts wrong, that this plan never existed. It simply contradicts the world as they and we know it. They grasp correctly that whereas offering Palestinians a mere autonomy is giving them less than a state, so far the story makes sense, offering them autonomy and full Israeli citizenship goes a long way towards a binational one-state federation. And that does not make sense. Experts' views on this are similar. They tend either to dismiss Begin's plan as a mere weird anecdote, or to evaluate this program from within the axiomatic two-state prism. In a 2016 book that's dedicated to the viability of the two-state solution, Nathan Thrall, one of the strongest commentators on the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, mentions the Begin plan as an interesting anecdote. By the way, I doubt that Nathan Thrall still supports the two-state solution, but it's remarkable for those who read the New York Times or the New York Review of Books here, that an author like that, just until recently, still was offering a two-state solution. He points out that it was later dropped, quote, to the great relief of all subsequent Israeli governments. Seth Antsiska, in his relatively newly published, is already 3 years old, defining research on the history and the aftermath of the Begin autonomy plan, treats it primarily as a program designed to, quote, prevent Palestine, a plot to undermine the Palestinians' aspiration to national sovereignty. There is another way to look at this allegedly anomalous, surprising, anecdotal plan, and that is to view it from outside the limiting constraints of the two-state prism. Begin's proposal contained a remarkable step, not just to preventing Palestine, although to be sure to that too, but to a binational one-state solution. Not an ideal step, of course, not one, I would argue, that could or should satisfy the Palestinians' demands, or those of honest Democrats, but still a plan that breaks the main barriers on our ability to imagine what's possible and what's not, while moving into one-state politics. For one thing, whereas it is true that the Palestinians aren't offered full national sovereignty in this program, this is Antsiska's point, full national sovereignty is not, as I argued, required for national self-determination, and to be sure, not of Palestinians and not of Jews. More significantly, by offering Palestinians in the West Bank and Gaza full Israeli citizenship, they are offered meaningful participation in Israeli citizenship, in Israeli sovereignty. True, whereas sovereignty belongs in democracies to the people, in a Jewish state, as I argued, the people are the Jews, not citizens as such, not even if all Palestinians are offered citizenship. I'm the one who just argued that. But still, I want to say that here precisely lies the absolutely crucial point. It is due to this fact, a Jewish state is a state of the Jews, that offering citizenship to all Palestinians seems inconceivable from within the familiar Zionist axioms. Begin's plan in this view, does not just prevent Palestinian sovereignty, it also transforms and really radically reshapes the meaning of Jewish sovereignty in Israel, pushing it not to the limit, but definitely beyond the limits of Zionism as we know it, and into a politics that's more familiar from his mentor, Jabotinsky, who spoke clearly of binational Zionism. Once we finally abandon the axiomatic two-state prism and the related assumption that national self-determination must be achieved through full sovereignty for Palestinians or Jews, can Begin's plan become a subversive tool, not to preventing Palestine, but to imagining a binational one-state federation, which the liberal Zionists of the future must begin to imagine. The plan's power consists in the fact that whereas binational politics is today rejected as post or even anti-Zionist, it is fully continuous with the original consensus of Zionists. And of course, no one would dare dismissing Begin as an anti or a post-Zionist. Herzl maybe, but not Begin. The Knesset, in any case, did not dismiss it. His plan did not remain a top secret for long. On December 28, 1977, having just returned from a meeting with Sadat, Begin read this program line by line from the Knesset's podium, defended it against fierce objections, warned that if it's not adopted, Israel will become apartheid in so many words, and proposed to vote. Quote, Mr. Speaker, the debate has ended. I ask for a vote, and I ask that each and every member of Knesset, without distinction of faction, vote according to his conscience. There is no imposition, no coercion. I am confident of the result. On the question of giving Palestinians in Gaza and the West Bank an autonomy, leaving the question of whose sovereignty in those territories open, offer every Palestinian the option to become full Israeli citizen, recognizing the right of return of Palestinian refugees in limited but large numbers, and the right of full economic liberty and freedom of movement on the whole territory, Israel's Knesset voted 64 in favor and 8 against. 40 abstained. The future for Israelis and Palestinians in our post-two-state solution era depends on extending visions of the sort. It's not going to be Begin's actual vision into federative politics, pushing the notion of sovereignty beyond that of Jewish sovereignty or Palestinian sovereignty, and endorsing full equal citizenship to all the inhabitants of the land. Sovereign would be the people who live in that territory. Moshe Halbertal argued that there was no question whether a Jewish state can be both Jewish and a liberal democracy, and I think that on that he was right, there cannot be. He also argued that the only question is what kind of a Jewish state we want to have. The liberal Zionism, if it has any future that we'll have to embrace, would depend on a completely different question. It will not be what type of a Jewish state we Jews want to have, but what type of a state we, the inhabitants of Palestine's territory, Eretz Israel, would venture to develop. This is no doubt very far-fetched, but not impossible to imagine. Herzl's original Zionist motto thus remains as relevant as it has ever been. If you will it, it is not a dream. I'm done.
Thank you, Omri. That was really great. Let me turn this over to our audience questions. While you think of questions, let me take the moderator's prerogative and ask you maybe a couple of initial questions. So going back to the Ben Gurion version, only of the support for the binational autonomy, you mentioned that that was a binational autonomy under some kind of imperial guarantee for Ben Gurion. And it seems like given the complete collapse of trust between the two groups in the last, say, 20 to 25 years, some kind of imperial guarantee for anything like this to begin getting off the ground would be necessary. Do you see anybody interested in getting into that game? Because to me, it looks like most imperial contenders are running away from it.
Yeah, I doubt very much that at the moment there is any imperial guarantee of this sort coming. However, the question is what needs to be done in order to convince people that something along those lines would be necessary. Also, there is a difference near between imperial guarantee and imperial sovereignty, right? So we need to say clearly for Ben Gurion, also for Herzl, when they were thinking these sub-sovereign entities, they were not thinking just about imperial guarantees, but they were actually thinking about imperial sovereigns that are in the territory. And autonomies are under the sovereign. So there's actual sovereignty that are doing this work. Of course, that's not what we're looking at. Even though sovereignty is a fluid concept, right? So we actually can look at, I don't think that we can look, say, at the US as sovereign in Israel, but we can see Israel's sovereignty as in some ways diminished, given its relation to the US. So this is, it's probably on a spectrum, the way we'll have to think about that. I don't see the interest in that at the moment, but I think that if there had been, also not something that's easy to imagine, I don't wish to pretend otherwise. If there had been interest in starting to pursue politics beyond the two-state solution, well, it's not like we're pursuing the two-state solution right now. If there will be a model that will start to receive shape as an alternative to the defunct two-state solution and to the current situation, however you want to describe it, I think that some imperial, call them imperial powers, could be interested in ensuring security in treaties and so forth and so forth. I don't think that this is inconceivable.
Just a quick comment before I pass it on to Naomi. Actually, there was one variation, more recent variation on this kind of imperial interests in one of the later versions of the Clinton proposals. In 2000, there was a proposal of joint international sovereignty over the Holy Basin, over some of the holy sites in Jerusalem. This was Clinton with his usual flair for a phrase called it sovereignty to God, but that was cover up for something else.
Good Jewish notion.
Yeah. Naomi, please.
Thank you. This was really wonderful and inspiring. And a couple of things. One is I'm reminded of a 1993 paper by Daniel Boyarin and Jonathan Boyarin arguing that Jewish particularism was incompatible with state power and military power. So it's an argument in many ways for diasporic Judaism, but also I'm wondering whether I'm assuming you're familiar with that paper and whether you see connections there. But the other is, I was so persuaded by your arguments, but then I'm sort of set up to be, given my own background politics. And you mentioned that people have argued against your views, and I'm wondering if you could sort of lay out a bit of what that dialectic has been like.
Yeah. Great. Yes, I can do that, and actually, I'd be glad to do that. I'm almost, when I read this paper once in a while, I'm almost disappointed each time I'm giving this paper, and that Moshe Halbertal or Mike Waltzer are not in the room, because I actually debated that with them face to face, and I don't consider their answers tenable, to be honest. So I'm happy to describe it. Of course, I describe it in my own terms. But I guess I can do this. There's at least one place where there's a video of those debates, so I'm not just inventing. There's a reference to the quotes or to the positions that I'm ascribing to Halbertal. Again, a person that I know just a little, but respect despite his criticism. I want to make that clear. First, before about the 1993 Boyarin paper. I do know the paper. I read it with my students actually in Germany, of all places, a couple of years ago, but I haven't returned to it since. It's a very similar type of argument, I take it. It just, it needs to address the current argument that you see formulated by Avishai Margalit and Moshe Halbertal, because I think those are, you need to grab the bull, I think, in its horns in that sense. And I think the earlier articles were not quite doing that. Not yet in that sense. Anyway, when I argued that to Halbertal, I'm trying to, let's do this. This is a great question. So I will take the time and I will answer it really in a thorough way. First, also something claimed by Halbertal, and not just by Halbertal, against my position, is a claim that my sharp distinction between the Israeli structure of citizenship and the European structure of citizenship, the sharp distinction that I show how they're completely different, because the Israeli one is ethnic and the European one is not, is a false separation. The reason, the European notion of nation state is also tied to ethnicity much more than I say. For example, Europe has European nation states, Germany is one of them, but not the only one, have laws that say that if you're historically German, then you can be naturalized, right? You become naturalized, for example. So there is a much tighter connection between ethnicity and the European understanding of nationhood than I say, and for that reason, the distinction that I make does not hold up. I want to say clearly, I think this is completely false. As you see, I'm not going to pretend. I think this is a non-starter. The European concept of citizenship that was achieved not without problems, right? It's not perfect. Not without problems, depends fundamentally on citizenship. That is, I happen to be a German Jew. I have German citizenship. And I just recently, it's a true story, I just recently sat face to face with Steinmeier, the president of Germany. And when we discussed this, in fact, this argument, I said, Herr Steinmeier, because I'm a German citizen, I am German just like you. And he would not imagine saying, no, I'm ethnically German, I speak German better than you, my history is different from us. It's sufficient, obviously, that I have German citizenship to count as German, right? That's the political issue. Of course, culturally, that's something else. I'm not culturally German, but my political standing as German are determined by my citizenship. And by the way, the law of return that Germany has, allegedly as if it were tied to ethnicity, would require saying that what? That I, for example, received German citizenship because I'm ethnically German. My grandparents, of course, were, they escaped Germany because they were not ethnically German. So to speak, the idea of the German and the other European laws that give you citizenship because of your ethnicity, their intention is precisely to include all those who had to escape or were displaced for all sorts of political reasons, to allow them to return. If any law that was similar to the European allegedly ethnic law were to be legislated in Israel, that would be just the Palestinians' law of return. Right? So to bring that as the argument why the European concept is tied to ethnicity is disingenuous. This does not mean that that there are no problems in European countries, that there is no systematical injustice, that there is no racism. Doesn't mean that all laws are perfect in this regard. Different countries have different situations. But that's the point. The constitutions or the basic laws of German European countries try to ensure that such laws will not exist, that such legislation will be criticized. In Israel, the situation is opposite, right? The basic structure of the state is meant to ensure the remaining ethnic distinction. That's one. That's an argument that is raised once in a while against me. Halbertal mentions this. That is my answer. That is not the main thing that Halbertal said, because the main thing that he said actually almost shocked me. Halbertal said, Israel does not have a Jewish sovereignty. The idea that it expresses Jewish sovereignty, that's a quote, is monstrous. By the way, which I take to be a de facto agreement then, that if it is, I would not call it monstrous, but that if it is, it definitely cannot be a liberal democracy. I don't need to argue that it's monstrous. I don't think it is, but it's not a liberal democracy. He tried to outflank the argument by saying the sovereign in Israel is the Knesset, the parliament, and the parliament has Palestinians in it. That's the sovereign, like in all liberal democracies. Again, that is, I take to be two things: factually false, and also in the state that Halbertal would like to imagine, also false. First, about the facts, about the current situation. Israel, forget the occupation even for the moment, even though it's a significant part of the argument, of the question of that, about that argument. Forget the occupation, consider just Israel. Israel, that is a basic law, the Knesset. What is it? Clause 7A, I want to say, passed in 85. I see Nir nodding, seems to remember better the actual reference. Says that you cannot run to parliament if you ever in word or deed, so very weak, very strong formulation in the sense that really, if you in word or deed contradicted the notion of a Jewish democracy. So that's the extension of what the Germans called well, the Americans call it militant democracy, right? The notion of militant democracy, not over democracy, but over the notion of the Jewish state. So in principle, Arabs cannot actually run to parliament, and Jews, if they do not believe in the idea of a Jewish state. So you cannot pretend that as a state of affairs is, the parliament as a sovereign is just a sovereign of all people. That's insane. Of course, the extension of militant democracy to the question of the state's Jewish character is, from democratic perspective, fully legitimate. There is no way that this goes off the ground. I know that Americans usually understand that militant democracy is even problematic when it comes to excluding people who are anti-democratic, but that can be defended. But the notion that people will be excluded because they do not believe in a Jewish state from participating in elections is obviously, cannot claim then that the parliament that was elected in this way is just sovereign and for that reason neutral to the question of ethnicity. By the way, the joint list proposed, when Israel legislated the nation state law, I suppose some people here would know what that is. When Israel legislated that infamous law, the joint list, representing mostly Palestinian voters, suggested it's a bill of its own. It was Israel, the state of all of its citizens. The Knesset did not vote and reject that bill. It excluded it from vote because it undermines the state as a Jewish democracy. So Halbertal on this is factually just wrong. There's no, it doesn't even get off the ground. I didn't even say what about the fact that Israel controls Palestinians who do not vote to the Knesset, and so forth and so forth, which, you know, if you understand that this is going on for 50 years and politically you cannot ignore it, but just from even, you know, that's sufficient to exclude the claim as flatly false. Of course, Halbertal would say, in my state, there will not be such a law.
I just want to make sure that we have time.
You're right. I'm talking too much. I'll just say very, very briefly. The point is this. You're right. I'm sorry. The reason why, even in Halbertal's imagined Jewish state, the state is about Jewish sovereignty, is that Halbertal makes no secret of the fact that that state will depend on ensuring Jewish majority. So first, we'll have to establish a Palestinian state. And we have to make sure that Palestinians do not have the right of return, because that will mess with the demographics. And only under the conditions in which Jews are as a majority, will we have a liberal Jewish state in which we say the state belongs to its citizens. But the condition for respecting, we will not respect the one person, one vote principle without a clear Jewish majority. In that situation, if that is your politics, you cannot claim that the Knesset is a sovereign and the state belongs to all of its people.
Excellent. Let's see, David and then Jeremy.
Hi. Yeah, thanks for this. Very interesting, and you know, broadly, I align with the politics. But I've got a couple of questions, really more about the implementation and the pathway. I just returned from Israel 2 weeks ago, and you know, even talking to Palestinians and people in movements that are quite radical, like Omdim Biyachad, you know, the immediate aspiration seems to be for full citizenship, that Israel should be a country of its citizens internally, and you know, and then moving from individual rights to recognizing ethnic minority rights. You know, and within mainstream Israel, you know, the identity of the Jewish state, of being Jewish Israeli, is so concrete. I mean, we think these things are just in our heads, but they're so concrete that the pathway to shifting that, it seems, you know, like a mountain to climb. Just saying im tirtzu, and you know, it doesn't quite get us there. So you know, is there some pathway that goes via integrating Palestinian Israelis as full citizens and then recognition of ethnic rights as well as a minority. But then even then, and I love the idea of sort of the fluidity. Yossi Beilin writing about this as well. The fluidity of citizenship and where you live, and trying to separate those things out, that, we don't have this just uniform geographic state where we expect it to be, one people, one state, one. But on the other hand, it's very unclear to me that Palestinians and Jewish Israelis want to live in the same state. There's so much enmity, there's so much that, why are we forcing people together and do we have models where the binationalism works out of a situation of such deep conflict? Maybe Lebanon isn't quite the model, but and Belgium is very different. Do we have models where this works practically?
Yeah, a couple of things. First, so I can only say this briefly, but in a way, it's the most important thing that I can say about this for now. I do not claim to, or I do not want to pretend that I think this is easy or around the corner. This is far, far from it. The question is whether we can rehabilitate such a visions of this sort as something that can be incorporated into mainstream thinking, not just anti-Israeli, not just anti-Zionist, but as something that can be incorporated as a political program. And by the way, not just for rhetorical reasons. Let's call it Zionist so that Zionists can take it. But also because I think actually, honestly, that makes me controversial in some corners, that Zionist ambitions are up to a point legitimate, precisely as the need for national self-determination and so forth and so forth. I think that stretch beyond a certain limit, they become problematically related to almost criminal politics. And that too needs to be stated clearly. So I don't pretend this is far-fetched. However, I don't pretend this is not far-fetched. However, I think that we can make a lot of progress by doing two things. First, trying to push a political party in Israel to start rehabilitating this type of politics as its actual political program. And relatedly, starting to make, say, world powers, I don't know if empires, receptive to those ideas. I want to say maybe one brief thing on each. When I just finished the book, there was a lot of optimism in the air about the joint list. That has shifted, but we're philosophers, so we can say this. We know well something. You're optimistic about something in one moment, and then it disappears like that. You should also learn from this that the fact that it disappeared doesn't mean that it cannot return. The joint list for a moment became the leader of Israel's left, with the demise of Meretz and Labor, who I think need to disappear, frankly, because they've lost, in my view, I mean, we don't need to argue now politics, but their old program has disappeared, and they are preventing voters from searching new alternatives. There was a moment when the joint list suddenly had 15 seats in parliament, when Bibi was going to annex the West Bank, and the main anti-annexation demonstration in Tel Aviv was led by Ayman Oda. Meretz and Merav Michaeli, Meretz were sort of there, but they were not even crossing the hurdle to enter parliament on their own. Labor was not even there. Right? I think that if such a joint list, which of course I need to say in the meantime is diminished and also weak and disappointing on the Ukraine and many, many problems. If a party like that were to create a genuine bridge to Jewish-Palestinian alliance within Israel, and start also, there is a relation here of content and form. With this alliance, speak about a binational program, because they are Jewish-Palestinian, they can do binational politics. I think that they can grow, hopefully. and start making this a legitimate agenda. Start convincing people that this is a legitimate agenda. One of the reasons why people do not support this is that people don't talk about it, don't create programs for that. People don't contribute money to institutions that will research the way in which this is being done, and so forth and so forth. By the way, in the West Bank, there is just probably the most important research, sociological research of the Palestinian society in the West Bank and Gaza shows that the biggest support in the West Bank is for a binational state now. That's a new result. Also, another fact that needs to be corrected most of the time, around 11–12% support of Hamas in Gaza, slightly more in the West Bank, but not the majority or something like that, as people comfortably like to say. That's one thing. My experience with my book here, people read the book and it had some reception. In Germany, for example, I told Nir before we started, it was an explosion. Not just by flattering my own successes now, with a book like that is clearly, and I've been writing a lot in German for, I don't know, almost 10 years now. People know that, by some standards, I'm an anti-Zionist. There is no secret of that in the German newspaper. Steinmeier took me as his personal guest on Luftwaffe 1 to his trip to Israel to visit Ruby Rivlin, because the German Foreign Ministry obviously liked the book. That's nice to me, but leave that aside. I think that it shows that there is a certain language that can be rehabilitated and legitimized. This is really a drop in the bucket, but it's a large drop. If people will do that, there will be a move, there can be a move into a different type of language. Again, far-fetched, but that is, I think, what needs to be done.
Okay, thank you.
Jeremy.
Yeah, thank you. I just wanted to invite you to say a little bit more about something that you didn't say here, and you don't say too much about in the book, but it's on the kind of image or the role of Haifa in the picture. And one of the reasons I'm really asking is, one of the things, going on from the previous question, trying to think about impediments to this kind of vision. There's lots of one of the things you try to deal with in the book quite nicely is, the kind of moral psychology of how the conflict has kind of developed over the ages, and a lot of what you say is quite negative about, in other words, forget, and so on. And I sense towards the I sense in that Haifa stuff that there may be something positive to say. So I really would like to hear more about it. It's quite say something about particularly the title.
I hope that I'm not going to answer the request for something positive by yet another something negative. Let's see. Also, in the days of Corona, negative is positive and positive is negative. We all know that. But actually, that's good, because it also reminds me, and I think that can be connected, that the answer to that is also tied to something that David asked, and I forgot to answer also about Haifa, right? Because it was a question of the model. Where from do you take the thought that the question is going to Scotland, is going to Belgium, Lebanon? People like to also refute my view by going to Yugoslavia or something. Where do you take the model from, right? Look, Haifa is a certain model for me, but Haifa is an idea, not the place. It's extremely important to say, right? Because the criticism that I reject of my position is that I have a rosy picture of Haifa. I don't know if Nir grew up in Haifa. I'm
a Haifite.
I was born in Haifa. I grew up in the Galilee. That's still very much my home, so northern to Haifa. I know Haifa relatively well, not as a real person from Haifa, like not Haifa the city, but I do not have a rosy picture of Haifa. And I can see that people can read the book and think that I do, but that's not the case. A city that is within a Jewish state where there is no equality between Jews and Palestinians, that's only one way in which Haifa is not a utopia. However, I think that the type of life that you can see in Haifa, and by the way, in my experience, also to the north of Haifa. If you go to the Galilee, it is far from simple and rosy, but it shows something that is possible and that you do not see, say, in Tel Aviv, right? Tel Aviv is maybe more liberal in all sorts of ways, but it's a Jewish city. There is a relation between Yafo and Tel Aviv, but not a form of real cohabitation, which I think in Haifa you can see is at least possible. You can see glimpses of it. You can see those glimpses in the Galilee, where there is an Arab majority. The fact that those glimpses are even possible within the very hostile political context in which they arise is the type of hope to which I want to cling. Look, also as David said, well, Jews and Palestinians don't want to live together. I don't know. I think that in the Galilee, you can see that they could have lived together if the context would have been changed. And the thought that we just cannot live together is false. It's false. Again, does not mean that in the Galilee it's simple. It's not. I'm from there, I know. But the idea that there will be a form of cohabitation, even if you look at Israel, is just not true. People could go to schools together. People definitely could do their shopping together, do businesses together, and so forth and so forth. A state that invested, I grew up in one of those villages, the Mitzpim, right, that were actually established in order to Judeify, or whatever they call it in English, the Galilee. But the people who went to live there were mostly strongly on the left. There was some kind of, and my father is still angry with me when I tell him, you went to Judeify the Galilee. My father votes now to the joint list, and he makes no secret of that, right? If those villages, someone invested all the money that went into them, into having Jews and Palestinians living there together, which I think could have been something that would have slowly increased, that would have been an interesting model. Of course, some people who live in those villages really oppose it. Some really support it. But again, I think that the question is, what is it that you foster? If someone wanted to foster that as a possibility, it would be an interesting one. And there will be a lot of people who could take part in that experiment. That's sort of the image that I see as possible, glimpses of it. I know Misgav, the people here are mostly not Israeli. Misgav is a very famous, I don't know if very famous actually, is well known for the fact that it actually excludes and tries to reject Palestinians who live in the Galilee from moving in, because it's a very nice place to live in. The people that I know in Misgav, actually a lot of them would love it if those villages would be joint villages. It's not completely far-fetched. That is a sort of gesture that I wanted to.
So, Omri, I think we are out of time. This was wonderful. Thank you very much.
Thanks. I'm sorry for taking so much time with my answers. So that probably
they were good answers. So thank you everybody for coming, and Omri, thanks again.
Thanks very much. It really is a great pleasure. Yeah. Okay.
Thank you.
Yeah.